Good morning to those who are joining us from the Americas. Good afternoon to the colleagues in Europe and in Africa. Good evening to Asia and the Pacific. My name is Marisofi Gianulli. I am the communications lead for the UN Environment Program Cool Coalition. This is a global platform of more than 250 governments, businesses, cities, financial institutions. We're all working together to accelerate action on sustainable cooling and extreme heat. And thank you for joining us for this final Cool Talk of 2025, our webinar series that explores many dimensions of cooling. This year, we have had a number of cool talks covering everything from cooling as a service, finance, cold chains. We covered passive cooling, refrigerants, nature-based solutions. And today, we turn to a topic that sits at the intersection of climate, labor, and industry, namely how extreme heat is reshaping supply chains, workforces around the world. So you will hear from our esteemed guests from the Cornell University Global Labor Institute, from the International Labor Organization's Better Work Team, the International Finance Corporation, the VF Corporation, and the Government of Cambodia, the Ministry of the Environment. So I want to extend a special thank you to our excellent speakers for participating in this series. But before we begin, let me give you a few housekeeping notes. First of all attendee cameras and microphones are off. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. Send all your questions throughout the webinar in the Q&A box. Some of them will be answered when you send them in writing, and others we will get to live when we reach the Q&A session of the webinar. And before we move into the findings of the new research note, The Heat is On, I wanted to offer a few reflections on the 2025 UN Climate Change Conference, COP30, which concluded a couple of weeks ago in Belém in Brazil. So I don't know how many of you were there. It was a small COP in terms of attendance because it was challenging. The location was in the Amazon. Temperatures were extreme. The heat affected everything, from power interruptions to unstable connectivity, and in many ways these conditions became part of the negotiations themselves. And they reminded us that extreme heat is the most immediate and tangible signal of climate change. It is shaping the environments in which decisions are being made. So, what were the outcomes of COP this year? This year we're a decade after the Paris Agreement of COP21, and we are entering an overshoot era. The world is expected to pass 1.5 degrees Celsius. Global temperatures are still to reach around 2.5 degrees Celsius by 2030. Progress on the new iterations of the national climate commitments, NDCs 3.0, was limited. Only about a third of the countries submitted them by COP30. So what does that tell us? That the emissions gap, the adaptation gap, the finance gap are still significant. But at the same time, there was a strong emphasis on methane and other superpollutants as the fastest levers to slow global warming, and negotiations advanced on adaptation metrics, on technology deployment, on elements of climate finance. So for sustainable cooling in particular, COP30 was a landmark moment for us. Together with the COP30 presidency, the UNEP Cool Coalition launched Beat the Heat, Mutirao contra o calor extremo. This is an implementation drive aimed at deploying sustainable cooling measures where the heat waves hit the hardest, which means in our cities. Urban areas can experience temperatures 5 to 10 degrees Celsius hotter than the surrounding regions because of the urban heat island effect. So cities are where exposure, vulnerability, and opportunity intersect. Beat the Heat supports cities to assess heat risks, plan cooling strategies, expand nature-based and passive cooling solutions, strengthen building codes, and use public procurement to drive markets toward efficient technologies. So right now we have 199 cities and over 100 partners that have joined Beat the Heat. These include the host of the COP30, Belém, but also New York, Los Angeles, Rio, Paris, Tokyo, my home city of Athens, where heat waves really hit hard. But also our partners include the World Bank, Google, the Global Covenant of Mayors, C40, and many others. Any of you can join, and you can now scan a QR code and let us know if you want to be part of the Cool Moves Only movement. At the same time, I will be sharing some links in the chat so that you learn more about Beat the Heat and our work. And you can also see the recording of the high-level event that happened at COP, where we launched officially the first cohort of participants. Now, at COP30, we also launched the Global Cooling Watch 2025. This is UNEP's biennial flagship assessment of cooling trends. The last edition was in 2023, and the past 2 years in between have been confirmed as the hottest ever recorded. So extreme heat is now officially the deadliest climate impact, contributing to approximately 500,000 deaths per year. And on top of that, according to the watch, by 2030, heat stress could reduce global working hours by the equivalent of 80 million full-time jobs. So you can see how it affects pretty much everything. But the watch also outlines a sustainable cooling pathway model. This combines passive cooling and clean energy, and if we are to follow that, it could reduce cooling-related emissions up to 97%, so basically eradicate them. These insights feed directly into the Global Cooling Pledge. This is the world's first collective commitment to reducing cooling-related emissions by 68% by mid-century. And at COP30, ministers met for the second cooling ministerial. We had Madagascar join the pledge. We now are up to 73 countries and many partners, including many subnationals. These leaders endorsed the Belém communique on extreme heat, showing their support behind the Beat the Heat initiative that I just talked about, and reaffirming that mitigation and adaptation go together. We also had the unveiling of the Intergovernmental Committee on Cooling. This is a strengthened governance body for the pledge. And we introduced something called the EPIC facility, which is designed to provide fast-track technical assistance and pilot deployment in the pledge countries. This basically will help inform policy, de-risk investments, and support market transformation. So you can watch the cooling ministerial, you can read the communique, following the links that will be shared in the chat. Last but not least, at COP30 Blue Zone, the UN Environment Programme was represented by the Buildings and Cooling Pavilion, which was co-hosted by the Cool Coalition and the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction. We had over 40 sessions exploring how to create resilient communities with sustainable cooling, better buildings, and smarter materials. So, where does this all leave us? We're entering the overshoot world, but action is advancing. Not everywhere, not at the same pace, but through a coalition of the willing, as is the phrase that was echoed during COP30. And as Margaret Mead said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed people can change the world. And for sustainable cooling, that group is growing, and you are part of it, so we are very happy about that. So with that, it is my pleasure to open the session by inviting Sabine Hartfeld, Senior Operations Officer for Manufacturing, Agribusiness and Services at the International Finance Corporation, to lead our panel discussion on The Heat is On. Sabine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marie-Sophie, and hi, everyone. Oops, I still hear an echo. No, that's fine now. Can you hear me well? Excellent. Thank you for inviting us here today. It's my pleasure to introduce you all to Jason Judd, who is the Executive Director of the Global Labor Institute at Cornell University. Thanks, Jason, for making the time and being here with us today. IFC about a year ago started working on a report together with Cornell that we launched last month in November and that you can find on the Better Work website. A report that is called The Heat is On, How Heat Stress Impacts the Apparel Industry, Jobs and Worker Health. And it basically puts the spotlight on how climate change impacts workers in apparel supply chains and how it impacts the industry as a whole, both in terms of export earnings, but also in terms of jobs and health, as I mentioned before. The report relies on existing research that Cornell had done in the past few years, including an analysis of data on temperatures that were collected by the Better Work program, which is an ILO IFC joint partnership in apparel supply chains across 13 countries. And I just want to say on behalf of Better Work, a big thank you to Jason and the team at Cornell for a really good collaboration on all of this analysis, but also on the recent report. Thank you also to ILO and to Rupa in particular as the Better Work Director, to the head of research who is on the line, Nikita, based in Geneva at the ILO headquarters, and for the ILO Better Work teams on the ground who we have connected with closely to get a feel of what is really happening in factories. How do workers manage? What's the impact currently when there is a flood, when there's extreme temperatures, and what could be done more? So all of these sort of on the ground empirical findings are reflected in the report, and that really enriched the research findings from Cornell. So it's a combination between an academic exercise, but also hopefully a very practical one. And we'll get to the recommendations towards the end of the webinar. So for now, let me just turn it to you, Jason, with the first question, and maybe the slides can be pulled up. But the first question is simply, can you walk us through the main findings of the report?
Sure. Well, thank you, Sebi. And our thanks too to the IFC and the ILO. It was great to work together on this new piece of research. At a very high level, we were trying to measure the economic impact of extreme heat and intense flooding. But I'll focus here on extreme heat, its impact on workers, and more specifically, its impact on apparel production. And we picked 4 countries, all important in global apparel trade: Bangladesh, Cambodia, Pakistan, and Vietnam. They all have different climate vulnerabilities, but they share an exposure to extreme heat. And in our analysis, Sabine, if you like, I can talk a little later about how the analysis came together. But the top line was that extreme heat and intense flooding, and extreme heat in particular, will reduce the growth rate for these industries in these 4 countries, and the gap between an industry that is adapting promptly to extreme heat will grow at one rate, and the same industry that fails to adapt to extreme heat will grow at a slower rate. And it's the distance, it's the gap between those 2 rates of growth that gives us that figure on the screen, the $65 billion figure. That's how much in export earnings these 4 countries will forego in 2030 by failing to adapt to extreme heat. And of course, there's a job impact. The number of new jobs will be higher in 2030 in these 4 countries, but the rate of growth will be much slower, and the distance between the gap will be about 1 million jobs. So failing to deal with extreme heat in apparel production would mean 1 million fewer new jobs created in these 4 countries. And then we extended the analysis and we pushed the model. We did this with our research partner at Schroders, an asset manager based in London. And we saw that by 2050, the gap between those 2 industries, the one that adapts and the one that doesn't, would be very, very wide. In fact, the gap would be about 65 to 70% in terms of export earnings, 65 to 70% lower by 2050. And the jobs loss, or the rate of jobs growth would slow such that it would create about 8.5 million fewer jobs across those 4 countries. So that's the big picture. Let's look a little more. I'll describe what we saw when we looked a little more closely at heat. We looked back over the last 20 years to see where changes in high heat is growing fastest, and then in the later reports we looked ahead. You can see here in this table. This comes from the the paper that we've just published together, you can see cities that are all important apparel production centers. And in 5-year blocks over the last 20 years, the number of days per year on which the mid-afternoon high temperature exceeded 35 Celsius is generally growing across all of them. There are a few anomalies, and that's because of the way we sliced the data, the particular years we chose. But you can see that almost without exception across these 10 or dozen centers, the number of exceedance days, the number of high heat days has been consistently growing over the last 20 years. And let me point out two places that are real standouts. One is Ho Chi Minh in southern Vietnam, and the other is Phnom Penh. They have in Cambodia. They're both important apparel and footwear production centers, and they've both seen a significant increase in the number of high heat days over the last decade and more. Here's a closer look at the centers in the 4 countries, Sabine, that we studied, and you can see here the volatility. These are the number of days over 35 Celsius in each of these years, and there's really quite a range in all of these countries. But look at the trend lines. You'll see that for all 5 of these countries, all 5 of these cities, the trend lines for exceedance days, high heat days, is upward. And in those 2 places that I just mentioned, Phnom Penh in Cambodia and Ho Chi Minh City, southern Vietnam region, both see the most significant increases. So this analysis is based on outdoor temperatures, but of course, apparel production happens inside, and it can be cooler inside, and it can be hotter inside than it is outside. And what we lacked for a thoroughgoing analysis across these 4 countries was data from inside factories. Can I have the next slide, Mary-Sophie? In apparel production, most employers, most of the brands who buy from them, many of the governments are not tracking on an hourly or even a daily basis the indoor temperatures. But it can be extremely hot in an ironing section or the sewing section or cutting and sewing with all the machines and all the bodies and all the material. The data set that we have that shows us what's happening inside factories comes from the ILO program, Better Factories Cambodia. So, Sabine, do you want me to talk a little bit about what the...
Sure. And just to clarify, so when Jason mentioned Better Factories Cambodia, that is the name of the Better Work program in Cambodia, where it all started 20 years ago. And it's very unique, right, that you have the 20 years of data here collected. I don't think that has happened in no other country, as far as I understand, right, Jason?
Yeah, this is a unique data set, and for a researcher like me, it's worth its weight in gold. We're hoping to get more of this kind of data because this allows us to identify which factories present the greatest risk to workers and to economic output. So I'll just describe what we found here. Over the last decade, we took data collected in the last decade by ILO staff members who visit and assess factories as part of the Better Work program. They measure early mid-afternoon temperatures in the production areas in every factory they visit. And in Cambodia, that's all of the apparel and footwear and travel goods export factories. And then we isolated the data. We were interested really in what was happening inside during the hottest months of the year. And in Cambodia, this is March, April, and May. These are dry bulb or air surface temperatures. The monitors, the assessors, use an instrument that measures the air surface temperature, and they're looking for temperatures that exceed 32 Celsius. 32 Celsius is the threshold set just for this ILO program in Cambodia. And you can see that in gold, the percentage of factories in which the temperature in the hottest of the production areas, so that might be ironing or washing, for example, exceeded that threshold in between 70 and 80% of these factories in this high heat season. And then in red, you can see the percentage of factories in which the indoor temperature in the hottest production area was above 35 Celsius. And that's obviously a much lower number, but it's still a significant percentage of the factories assessed, which means it's awfully hot in a good number of factories in Cambodia over the last 10 years. Just one more thing I'll add here, Sabine. You can see that over time that the trend is downward. There are on average fewer factories each year that are in violation of that heat standard. And I think there are three things going on there, and we gathered this from our conversations with ILO staff and others. One is the movement of the industry away from the old industrial centers in Phnom Penh, where they were often working in warehouses or poured concrete buildings, just not built for purpose. Ventilation, among other things, tended to be poor. And as factories are moving, rebuilding, they're moving outside of what Mary-Sophie described as the urban heat island effect in cities like Phnom Penh. So it's cooler to the places that they're moving, 10, 20, 30, 50 kilometers away. That's one. The second is the new construction incorporates some of the design elements that we're looking for. They encourage passive cooling, and they introduce, this is the third thing, they introduce some more efficient active cooling systems. So over time, we see the temperatures declining, but still almost a third of factories in the last year measured here had temperatures above 35 Celsius. So there's two things: a long way to go in Cambodia and in other places where we presume they have similar issues, but we don't have the data. And another point to add here is that this problem doesn't take care of itself. It doesn't go away by itself over time. We know that there will be more high heat days, and we can expect this problem to grow unless there's an investment in adaptation.
Thanks, Jason. I was just going to ask about flooding, because we've seen that in real time in the last month in Sri Lanka, another apparel producing country, not part of the research, but that was hit by this cyclone affecting about 2 million people. So it's a real serious risk that can wipe off entire parts of the country. Tell us about what you see the future looks like.
Yeah. Well, in the economic analysis that we did, we found that the economic damage is done predominantly by heat. It runs sort of 9 to 1 in terms of damage done heat versus flooding. But when flooding occurs, when it's intense and the inundation levels, the flood levels are high, it can be devastating. It's not happening everywhere and all at once as it does, for example, in a heat wave. But we looked in our higher ground report with Schroeder's at several cities, including Dhaka, and it's Dhaka, a major apparel producing center that you see in this slide. On the left are two scenarios for 2030, and on the right the same two scenarios in 2050. The blue dots represent export apparel factories. Gold represents sea level rise or storm surge flooding, and red represents riverine flooding or rainfall. And the more intense the color, the more intense the flooding. So dark red or dark gold represents flooding of a meter or more. And you can see in 2030 that some regions are already touched by routine flooding. And in 2050, on the right, you can see same factories are at much greater risk. The intensity of flooding is greater, and it's much more widespread, both for sea level rise and for riverine flooding. These are for routine flood events. On the right, an RP10, so what we used to call a 10-year flood, which now occurs much more frequently. And we used a very middle of the road climate scenario. This was using the old nomenclature. This was RCP 4.5. So flooding is a significant risk. And we found in both cases that in conversations with employers and with brands that while some had made plans for extreme heat and intense flooding, that most were not yet making plans, not yet prepared.
Thanks. So here's where we really get to the meat of how you got to the 65 billion damage to export earnings, right? So tell us a bit more about what the finding is here, and some specifics by country.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we measured flooding and heat differently. Flooding we measured in terms of disruption days. A flood inundation level of X would produce a number of would disrupt production for Y days, and the higher the flood, the longer the disruption. And you can add up those lost disruption days in terms of earnings lost at the factory level, and that we can isolate because we know precisely which factories are at the greatest risk. Our flood model allows us to see this. Heat is measured. The heat impact is measured is different. It's not disruption days, but it's the slowdown in worker productivity. And we used a formula that comes from academic literature, studies conducted over the last 20, 30 years. And the rule of thumb that we use here is that for every 1 Celsius increase in the wet bulb globe temperature, for every 1 Celsius increase in this heat and humidity index above 25 and 26 Celsius, the fall off in worker productivity in a manufacturing setting like apparel is 1.5%. So a 1 Celsius increase in the wet bulb temperature produces a 1.5% decline in productivity. And knowing how many high heat days we'll have in the future, we're able to estimate day by day the decline in worker productivity, which translates into factory level earnings. And we could stack all that up day by day, factory by factory, and get an estimate of how much might be lost in earnings in 2030 and again in 2050 due to high heat. So the figures in the table here for each of the 4 countries really come from the damage that heat does, and you can see, as I was describing earlier, the effect of that compounded slower growth. If factories are failing to deal with extreme heat, failing to bring indoor temperatures down in order to improve worker productivity and protect worker health, their earnings will be slowed. And you can see that by 2030 in Bangladesh, that figure is already about, is a fall off of 26 billion, which is significant. That's not a hard loss. It doesn't mean that the Bangladeshi apparel industry is earning 27 billion less in 2030 than today. It just means that by failing to adjust, by failing to adapt and reduce workplace heat, they're going to grow at a slower rate, and the opportunity cost there is 27 billion. It's lower in Cambodia. The industry is considerably smaller. It's a similar size in Pakistan, which is already accustomed to extreme heat, but does not have effective. I'm speaking here generally. Doesn't have effective regulation or effective cooling systems in some of its factories. And Vietnam, where the number is the largest or second largest behind Bangladesh, because it's also one of the largest industries. So you can add up all those opportunity costs, those losses, and it's about $68 billion in 2030. The average percent across the average percentage loss is about 22% across these 4 countries. And then, as I said earlier, the gap between these 2 scenarios yawns by 2050. You get much larger losses because your slower growth rate just compounds.
Thanks. And then the most important, I think, from IFC and World Bank Group perspective is, of course, the impact on jobs, right? And here again, as you said rightly, Jason, it's about the opportunity cost, about jobs that are not going to be created. So it's not a net reduction in number of jobs, but it's still a staggering number. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, well, using the same approach, we were able to translate those losses or slower earnings from a failure to adapt to extreme heat in the 4 countries into jobs losses. We see that we're able to calculate the change in the job creation rate or the job growth rate, and it too slows significantly. In the first in 2030, you can see that in Bangladesh already 250,000 jobs foregone, a smaller number in Cambodia, a similar number to Bangladesh in Pakistan, and a similar number in Vietnam. Those together represent about 1 million jobs that those 4 industries would fail to create by 2030. And then again, as before, the number of jobs lost or foregone by 2050 is nearly 8.5 million across these 4 countries. These are not locked in losses. They're just a picture of what might happen in these 4 countries if the industry doesn't make prompt investments to reduce workplace temperatures.
Thanks. So now that you laid out the sheer magnitude of the problem, maybe we can switch towards thinking what can be done about it. And of course, regulations are a key part of it. This slide shows a number of countries with regulations.
The only country on our list from the study here is Vietnam. Vietnam has set a national workplace heat standard. So there's a threshold. It's not a stop work level, but it means that when temperatures inside in manufacturing, and that would medium effort is how the Vietnamese government classifies apparel and footwear production, the employer has to make some changes at 32 Celsius, which is not insignificantly the same threshold that the ILO Better Work Program in Cambodia uses to measure, look for violations of workplace heat. So many countries in the apparel producing world have specific standards. 2 do not. Cambodia does not, and Bangladesh does not. And then in compliance or enforcement is another issue altogether.
Yes, absolutely. And that's the next slide. I think it's a segue to what is being done already. Go ahead, Jason, give us some good news.
Yeah, well, we see governments taking up this question. The Cambodian government is, for example, now considering new occupational safety and health standards that may include a standard on workplace heat. We've seen the apparel brands taking up this issue. Several have already set standards. They have heat thresholds that go back years. VF is one, Nike is another, Levi's is the third. Others are in the process of developing it, as are the multi-stakeholder groups that serve the industry. And worker organizations too are taking up the issue. They've long felt the effects of this, but they're beginning to draft language that would go into bargaining agreements, into binding agreements. They're participating in policy discussions at the national level to win protections from extreme heat and other effects of climate breakdown. Manufacturers have been at this for a long time. Some have done literally nothing. They don't have active cooling systems. They don't have heat action plans. But others have been developing cooling systems and operational changes that allow them to bring down the temperatures when it's very hot outside and to protect workers and to protect their output. And we see the number of manufacturers who are exploring this and making investments rising. But frankly, it's not keeping pace with the rise in the heat levels. And then the last question is, who's going to pay? This is always the question in the apparel industry. Who's going to pay when a new problem or an old problem is finally working its way towards solution? And financing for manufacturers to make the necessary investments can come from the multilateral lending institutions. The IFC, among others, is working on is building programs to support those investments. So there's a lot going on, but it's as yet uncoordinated.
We want to very quickly turn to Jens As, who is a senior manager of VF. VF is a US apparel brand that owns Timberland, the North Face, Vans, and other brands. And just have a very quick reaction from you, Jens, if you could tell us a bit about the standards that VF is imposing on the supply chain. And then we'll turn to IFC to talk a bit about financing. And finally, we have someone from the Cambodian government online, from the Ministry of Environment. Would be great to hear their reactions too. So let's quickly turn to you, Jens, and then keep up the pace. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you, Sabine. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak and also share some reflections from our company and maybe a bit how the industry is already working on this. It's indeed very interesting reading the report and also now listening to Jason, especially for us working in global supply chains. So I've been asked to share a bit about how VF is addressing these increasing concerns, especially from a compliance standards point of view. Just a few words about VF. We are a global apparel footwear equipment company. We're headquartered in the US and we're home to brands such as Vans, the North Face, and Timberland. We source products from around 40 countries worldwide, with the majority of production being in Asia Pacific region, in countries that are increasingly impacted also by a changing climate. So yeah, that's really why it's important for us to address these challenges. I think we as other brands have for many years been really addressing climate mitigation, reducing our carbon emissions, but we are now seeing very much the effects of changing climate is happening and impacting workers, their livelihoods, and so on. So climate adaptation and looking at how we can better safeguard our business and the people in it is becoming an increasing importance or priority for companies such as VF. So from VF's point of view, we do have our global compliance principles that all our factories that we work with must follow. These principles set very clear expectations for our suppliers, how they should operate, how they should treat their workers. And building on these principles, we have our facility standards. These serve as the foundation for eventually our factory compliance audit program. And it is in these standards that we for several years have defined a section on air temperature. So this section then defines ideal indoor temperature as 15 to 30 degrees Celsius. And we've defined lower borderline ranges from 10 to 15 degrees at the lower level and an upper borderline level of 30 to 35 degrees Celsius. So in practice, this means that if temperatures fall below 10 degrees or above 35 degrees, if we record this during our audits, this will result in non-compliance for the factory, and we will initiate a corrective action plan. Also, where local laws are stricter than the VF guidelines, which we also saw on Jason's slide, that there are examples where legislation is already there and maybe having stricter borderlines than what is defined in the VF facility standards. We then follow whatever is the local requirement. In our audits, we also assess ventilation and airflow systems in factories. And factories are deemed also non-compliant if we find that systems are inadequate to prevent excessive heat and associated risks. So also there will be a corrective action plan triggered if we find such non-compliances. Lastly, I also just want to mention how we work around heat stress related to worker well-being, especially through our worker and community development program. We invest in several initiatives to safeguard workers' health and safety, their well-being, and so on. One of our focuses is on WASH, water, sanitation, and hygiene. And here we've been working in partnership with WaterAid and also water sanitation for urban populations, where we've developed WASH workplace guidelines which are especially implemented in our factories in Bangladesh and Cambodia, which we similar to the studies we heard about, also define as high risk countries when it comes to heat stress and also in high need of wash interventions. So what are these guidelines doing? So they provide basically a step-by-step guidance, action plans, and SOPs for factories to, among others, ensures access to safe drinking water and saline water during high temperatures. It also instructs factories to maintain cooling measures in factories. It also calls on factories to facilitate longer and more frequent breaks during periods of high temperatures. And finally, there's also an element facing the workers themselves, so educating them on hydration, on their own personal heat stress prevention, so that people know better as an individual how you can take better care of yourself during periods of extreme heat and what are the health risks also associated with that. I think in the coming years, we as other brands probably will try to scale up our efforts and go beyond to more countries. I think we're very much in the learning stage still, so we very much welcome all this research and really like also looking at how this is impacting our business and putting things into monetary terms. Also, I think very much help brands like VF and others to push the needle and the agenda on this going forward.
Thank you.
Yeah.
No, that's really good, and it's glad to hear the research is helpful in a practical way. And thanks for also highlighting really concrete things that are being done in the factories. Now, I'd love to hear from Roosbeer Muzik, who is my IFC colleague. He's called Mr. Cooling within the IFC, very passionate about this topic, as many of you know him, to quickly run through some of the initiatives of IFC on cooling.
The idea behind this, and you heard this from Marie-Sophie as we started, you can go to the next slide, is that already help is coming your way. So IFC, as we mentioned, is part of the Global Cooling Pledge and the Cool Coalition. So we are, in fact, working with a lot of different agencies, governments, businesses, NGOs around the world to help you. And through our cooling initiative, we have what we call a 5x5 plan that's looking at 5 sectors where cooling is needed the most. And we are embedding this through 5 engagement pillars, which are really meant to scale up financing and get the kind of the market going. On the next slide, you will see, because I think that was one of the questions, was how can we help different companies? So for companies that are part of the IFC investment process and are interested in IFC's finance, we actually can deploy a range of solutions thanks to the support of the UK government. So obviously we're doing things like market support and awareness now, but with the particular companies, we can do technical support and assistance. And our key element is to help match you with innovators around the world who have done this. And I think one of the questions was also how to do this without just doing air conditioning. And there are innovations in the building facade, in films that can be put on roofs, and many other ways that we can help companies do this particular part. The good news also, and next slide will show that to you, is that there are tools that are currently freely and publicly available also to you, because we are launching it as a public good. So through the EDGE program, because one of the questions here, we have analyzed 4 countries, what about the rest of the world? You actually can start projecting what the heat stress is going to be for your particular factories, to look at what the increased temperatures are going to be in the future, and then to start to understand what that cooling load would be, and how to address the comfort level of the workers inside. So if you want to get it down below a certain temperature, this is what you need to do, either through passive measures, these are the things in the building facade, or active measures. And the next slide will show you our work with the Building Resilience Index. And so the BRI is measuring things like more climate shocks, and it helps you identify risks around 4 categories: wind, water, fire, and geoseismic. You saw that we focused a lot on the flooding as one big particular area. Companies can then manage risk. We have best practices, there are guides on helping you both physical integrity as well as operational continuity. And then you can help disclose that risk. And this is the part that gets connected to the financial markets. So through tools like Edge and the Building Resilience Index, companies that are disclosing and are verifying and certifying their assets can access international green finance, whether that flows through IFC. IFC is also working on funds as well as in textiles. They can help the companies, if we cannot reach you directly. And we're working with insurance companies. We have partnerships now in East Asia where these risks are, more acute, to basically help put together the insurance premiums and have that be assessed as part of the insurance process. And on the next slide, you'll see, a lot of this we already have disclosed before. So we, with UNEP as our partner, put together our flagship report, Cooler Finance. So you heard UNEP is doing a lot of work kind of on sizing the challenge. And I think what IFC has done is to put together what can be the solutions. And that's really the chapter 3 of the Cooler Finance report. It includes mentions of things like, passive cooling strategies. It talks about using Edge to actually design building codes, and this is the work that the governments can do, and talks about what are the enabling environment that is needed in order to really deploy cooling and make it be front and center in the minds of the companies and the government as well. All of this with the idea is that the cooling is both a mitigation, right? We're looking at efficiency, but we're also looking at adaptation. We want to help companies prepare for the increased heat in the future.
Thanks, Rosmir. That was a very good overview and very quick. Thank you. And then finally, Mr. Loon from Cambodia, from the Ministry of Environment. We heard earlier from Jason that Cambodia is doing a little better, that factories are moving to cooler places, and that there's a lot of active and passive cooling driving this positive trend. Any reactions from your side about what Cambodia is doing next? And thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you, Sabine, and good evening from Cambodia to everyone on this webinar today. Thank you for the opportunity to allow me to speak on how the heat stress impact on the apparel industry, job, and work health. So the challenge is rapidly become one of the greatest threats to the Cambodian development, especially extreme heat and its impact to the worker, productivity, and human well-being. So today, I want to highlight why centering labor and cooling strategy must be important to Cambodia climate response, and what the practical action are emerging on the ground. So as Dr. Jason is already presented, so Cambodia is hot and humid country, and the situation is worsening rapidly. So Cambodia is already experiencing among the fastest rising temperature in the Southeast Asia. So in 2023 and 2024, heat index level frequently exceeded 40 degrees Celsius, that placing millions of the people at the risk, especially workers in the construction, garment factory, agriculture laborer, transportation, market vendor, waste collector, and informal workers who often have little to no protecting from the extreme heat. During the 2024 heat wave, schools across the Cambodia were temporarily closed to avoid the heat exposure to the student. During that time, Ministry of Health also issued the early warning to the student and also vulnerable group of the people. For Cambodia is relying solely on the air conditioning, dry up energy use, and greenhouse gas. Our approach is to provide passive cooling strategies such as making a green space, designing to block, reflect, release, or ventilate heat before switching on any machine. To implement this vision, government of Cambodia through the Ministry of Environment have prioritized the sustainable cooling solution as a part of and also Cambodian Climate Change Strategy Plan 2024 to 2033 and National Cooling Action Plan that we call NCAP. So our NCAP is served as the virtual framework guide our effort to reduce the energy demand and greenhouse gas emission from the cooling sector. We also integrated passive cooling technology in urban planning and promoting energy efficiency cooling appliance to reduce reliance on the traditional air conditioning system. Through regional partnership, we aim to adopt innovative cooling system that benefit our community while supporting national development. We are moving from paper to the practice. Our demonstration pilot run with the Institute of Technology and of Cambodia and developer show that passive cooling strategy can lower indoor temperature by up to 7 degrees Celsius, better thermal comfort, and significantly reduce electricity use. This local evidence is crucial for shaping building energy regulation and guide public procedure. Cambodia is taking initial steps with support from UNEP Coal Coalition, UNDP, and other partners. We are promoting passive cooling strategies such as cooling roof, ventilation improvement, setting, and reflection material. For example, in several factories in Kandal Province and Kampong Speu Province that apply this measure have already reduced indoor temperature by 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. And one of the construction company in Phnom Penh recently pilot shed rest station and hydration break for its laborer with positive health and productive outcome. This progress is powered by strong partnership. Cambodia joined hands with the UNEP Coal Coalition, UNDP, UNESCAP, JICA, and our ASEAN peers, especially Singapore and Vietnam, to connect our national work to global momentum and regional learning. However, this effort must be scaled up. We need clear labor guidelines on heat protection, more affordable cooling measures in the workplace, and target support for informal and outdoor workers who are most exposed. At the same time, we recognize that our progress is not without challenge. Limited financial resources and technical capacity continue to hide the large-scale implementation, and target support at the subnational and community level remain important. Addressing this barrier will require coordination action and stronger collaboration across the government, private sector, and development partner. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Loon. It's good to hear how Cambodia really recognizes what's been done, but that a lot more is needed. So I'm happy to hand it back over to Marie-Sophie, just right on time, 9 on the dot. Marie-Sophie, for you for closing remarks.
Thank you, Sabine, and thank you, everybody. Just so you know, our speakers have now replied to over 10 questions in the chat. So we will be sharing everything with you in our summary article. Thank you again. It's been an important discussion, and I am sharing the link where you will find our recording and the presentations that you saw today. Our next Cool Talk will take place next year on the 22nd of January. We will explore lessons from the Tech Emerge program. We will introduce you to a new global database of cooling innovators, so you want to stay tuned for that one. Check out our social media accounts for more information about registering. And I want to thank you once more for your time and engagement and wish you all a restful holiday season. Goodbye.